everyone. This is Albert Barrocas, ASPEN charter member since 1976, a member of the advisory board. In our continuing series of interviews with historical perspectives as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of ASPEN, it is my privilege and honor to interview and introduce to you our fourth president in 1980, Dr. James Long. Jim, it's great seeing you, and it was great that you have agreed to this interview. I know that long before I became a member in '76, there was a lot of work that was done. We have already interviewed Mary Seltzer, Ronnie Chernov, who sends her regards. And so I wanted to get from your perspective, first of all, a brief summary of your educational background and then your activities as to how you became interested in nutrition first. And then we'll talk specifically about ASPEN.
Thank you, Al. It's great to see you after all these years. Yeah, this is really a momentous occasion, the 50th anniversary of ASPEN, and there was, as you intimated, there were a lot of jumping around and talking and meeting in those early days that led to the formation of the society as we know it today. You know, I went to college and medical school at Tulane a long time ago, and then I did my surgery training at the University of Pennsylvania, and that happened to coincide with the chairmanship of Jonathan Rhodes, who was chief of surgery at Penn. And my chief resident when I was an intern at Penn was Stanley Dudrick. So I was baptized into the nutrition line of thinking in the surgical world very early on in my surgical training. Then I subsequently worked with Stanley Dudrick in the lab a few years later, in the about 1971, 72 time frame. So that was where it started. My interest in nutrition and in the welfare of our surgical patients started right there at the beginning of my internship.
Well, Jim, I think you and I graduated the same year, 1966. You graduated from Tulane, and I graduated from Emory. Did you have any previous nutrition education in med school or undergrad or had a special degree?
I didn't have what I would call nutrition education at that point, but I was exposed to Dr. Gracie Goldsmith, who was a public health physician at Tulane who was very much into nutrition. I was at least alerted to the importance of nutrition by Dr. Goldsmith at that time. So, you know, it was lurking there, but it was way back in the back, and it came to consciousness when I started my internship.
Many years later, I moved to New Orleans, and so I was part of the volunteer faculty at Tulane and at the School of Public Health. And I think that by then Dr. Goldsmith was not there, but I think her main interest was in vitamins, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, she was very instrumental in some of the early discoveries related to vitamins.
Well, tell me a little bit about you were working in the lab. I guess you said you were an intern when Dr. Dudrick was chief resident, so I guess you were an honorary puppy.
Yeah, that's right. There were some of the puppies still going
Right.
in those early days. I did not personally work with the puppies. When I was in the lab, I basically set up the metabolic laboratory at the VA hospital in Philadelphia, and spent most of that year working in that lab, which was just, you know, across the back street from the university hospital.
And we've heard stories from others, and we have some codified information. But what, from your perspective, was the need to proceed with a society? You know, why was there a need to have that niche?
Yeah, I think, Al, that my recollection is that the existing nutrition societies uh, were more focused on micronutrients and other things of that sort, and were not really focusing on the technologies involved in parenteral and enteral nutrition. And so it was kind of a restlessness, I guess, among a number of us who were working in the field at the time to begin to find a place where we could, as professionals, meet and discuss those kinds of issues. The issues like, simple things like inserting a subclavian catheter, like, how to, formulate an appropriate solution that could be infused. Initially, we didn't have intravenous fat available to us, although it came along fairly soon thereafter. But it was really, I think, out of the need for uh, a forum that did not exist at that time.
Great. Can you give us other highlights of uh, historical nature around that period of time, or subsequently, once you got formed, obstacles that you might have encountered, how were you able to spread the word? Uh, uh, Looking at industry support, I mean, you have to have money to run the show.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Unfortunately, both the University of Pennsylvania and then when I was in the Army following my time at Penn, and subsequently at the University of Texas, working again with Stanley Dudrick. Uh, During those times, we had access to funds uh, from a local standpoint, but there was need to get people together. I remember particularly uh, a meeting in those early days, and I don't remember the exact date, but we all met. There were about 6 or 8 of us met at George Blackburn's home on Cape Cod. And we spent an entire weekend planning and saying, what should this look like? How should it develop? How should it be managed? All of those kind of nitty gritty questions that are essential to the running of a reasonable professional society.
What about industry support? How were you able to get that?
Well, the support came slowly in the early days. There were obviously NIH funds and monies of that sort that were available for the established researchers, but it really was more aimed, not so much aimed at getting funding as it was aimed at having a forum for uh, uh, for those of us who were working in the field, particularly with parenteral nutrition at that time, to get together to discuss issues, to talk about the problems that we have and how to solve them, things of that sort. So it was a time of almost experimental growth of the organization. And there were some growing pains during that time. But I think because there was a specific need out in the medical community for the kind of information that those of us working in the field had, I think among the first 8 or 10 people who were involved, we were on the road speaking all the time. Even as a resident, I traveled around the country talking about the things we were doing at Penn, for example. I know George Blackburn and Mitch Kaminsky, and shortly thereafter, John Rambeau, Ronnie Chernoff. There were a multitude of people who were traveling around the country teaching people how to insert subclavian catheters, how to formulate the solutions that we were infusing. Of course, it grew from there to more emphasis on the enteral nutrition at a little bit farther along the line.
And I personally was a beneficiary of all those efforts and started providing some lectures at the local level in the mid 70s. One of the things that attracted me to Aspen and has continued, I think is one of the strengths of Aspen from the beginning, were two things. One, the focus on a interdisciplinary approach. So it wasn't just a physician-oriented group. This was information that you wanted to get to the bedside, regardless of whether you were in an academic center or like I was in a non-affiliated community center. During those early days, was there ever any resistance to not involving what I call the core four, pharmacists, dietitians, physicians, and nurses? And was there ever any sense of, no, this is just an elite group only for academics, we're not going to involve community level health professionals?
Albert, I think not. From the very beginning, there was appreciation that we were dependent on our nurses and our dietitians and our pharmacists. And this was not a physician's gig. This was a team effort, and it took a team to pull this off. Not meaning ASPEN, but to pull off parenteral nutrition. You had to have a team. You have to have a pharmacist who knew what he or she was doing. You had to have a nurses who knew how to take care of things properly. You needed to have dietitians to help us, particularly transitioning from parenteral to enteral nutrition in the course of a given patient's progress. So it was never really envisioned as being a physician-only academic type of society. It was much more of a practical, applied at the bedside level, as you say, type of effort. From the very earliest days at Cape Cod, for example, the discussion was around how to have a professional society that in fact incorporated all of the individuals who were involved in the process of actually delivering the care that we were talking about.
And when I talk about the core four, of course, we expanded much, very quickly to researchers and others. The reason why I asked the question is because this video is going to be seen by subsequent younger people that are part of teams. Today, you have a critical care team, you have a burn team, a trauma team. But in those days, it was very unique. I'm not going to say it was the only example, but I think Aspen was the cornerstone of healthcare teams that were not only multi, but inter, and what I call now transdisciplinary, where you have cross-functioning. Because in some cases, you may not have a knowledgeable or available pharmacist to do the mixing, and someone else does it. So I thank you for that explanation and verification that Aspen was the genesis, if you will, of interdisciplinarity. And I think it's so important. Now, as we move on, I'd like to ask you, what is your vision for the future, first, of nutrition support in general, and how do you see Aspen moving in the next 50 years?
Well, that's a difficult question for me, Al, because I have been, out of practice now for 20 years. So, I'm not in touch with exactly how things are on the ground, so to speak. But what I would say is that the teaching of nutrition in medical schools is still deficient. There's still a need for medical schools to recognize the importance of nutrition of patients of all sorts, not just surgical patients, but patients of any sort whatsoever. Particularly now that hospital stays are shorter and shorter, and many times people with significant nutritional needs are sent home and don't have the kind of team support that they might have had in the hospital a number of years ago. So I think an emphasis on education would be a very important component of what ASPEN does moving forward. I know there's a huge education effort already, and I'm totally aware of that. But I think that there's no letting up of the need for the teaching of nutrition and its importance and its effect on all disease processes and on normal function. And you know, it's interestingly just reflecting in terms of the historical precedent, the theme of my presidential address in 1980 was education. And
Excellent.
it was an emphasis that from the very beginning of ASPEN was that it was important to have the research, it was important to have the team, but it was also important to stress the importance of education, both nutrition education and technical education of how to deliver good nutritional care of whatever type.
Well, one of the things that I recently was concerned about is that despite our 50 years of existence, we still have a in-hospital or admission rate of malnutrition in the 30 to 50% range, depending on which study you look at, and particularly in the elderly. Do you think that ASPEN should broaden its scope to include other aspects of nutrition besides just nutrition support? Because it would change the characteristics.
Well, I think it spills over into other types of nutrition that's needed. You mentioned the elderly. I think it's very important that the educational components extend into the various communities, like the aged, like the, you know, even young people. There's often problems with athletes, for example, knowing what is the best in terms of nutrition. So, you know, I don't think there needs to be limits on the scope of nutrition. It doesn't need to be hospital related. And I think expanding the education base to include all of those other potential components is a good way to proceed.
Well, Jim, this has been great. Well, do you have any other specific memories or highlights that you'd like to share with us?
One other thing that I'm not sure anybody but one other person in this world knows what I'm about to tell you. And that is on a plane trip back to Houston in about 1976, I drew on a scratch pad that I had with me a logo for Aspen, and it is almost exactly what the logo of Aspen is today.
Really? That is
Yeah.
very, very interesting.
That
I
was
didn't know
the
you were
one
an
memory
artist.
that I thought of that would be unique.
I didn't realize you were an artist. Any other memories?
No, you know, there were so many great memories, and the opportunity to know people who had those same interests around the country and around the world. You know, there was one occasion, for example, when George Blackburn, Stanley Dudrick, and I traveled to Barcelona to a Spanish seminar on parenteral and enteral nutrition. There was another occasion when the International Society met in Montpellier, France, where we were there and presented our work and heard the work from all around the world. And an anecdote from that trip to Montpellier. Arvid Retland, who was the vice president for research and science at the Vitrum Company in Sweden, was the moderator of a panel of people that included a guy from China, a guy from Japan, a guy from Italy. I was there from the US. There was a guy from Leeds in England, and there was a guy from the Frimer Company in Germany. and Dr. Retlin introduced each of those speakers in their own language.
Wow. And he was the instrumental in lipids.
Yes, he was the Vitrum company was the company that developed the original intravenous fat solution.
What year was that, Jim?
Oh, that was somewhere around 1978, 79.
Okay, so it was just after we had our first meeting of Aspen in 77 then.
Yeah.
Well, Jim, it's been a delight to have you help us with the history. Hope that we see you again. And like to leave a few seconds here for you to say your goodbyes or any other thoughts that you may have. Again, thank you a lot.
Well, I thank you very much for the opportunity to be interviewed and to sort of reconnect. These are a number of things that I haven't thought about in a number of years. I do stay busy. I'm working nowadays primarily with recovering addicts. I work with a couple of nonprofits and stay busy. And I believe
You're
that
still in Birmingham, Alabama, right?
in Birmingham, Alabama, and I firmly believe that staying busy is the way to stay alert and active and healthy.
Well, you look great. You look great.